Hello and welcome back to Genesis Designs and Modelcraft, and welcome back to the Modelling for Beginners series with the Airfix Mosquito PR16. And in this episode we really are getting to the end of the construction process and starting to look at paintwork. So very quick update. I now have 2 wings completed, both of them pre-sprayed as we did in the last episode. All the filling is done, all the sanding is done, and anywhere I felt necessary I've added Mr. Surfacer 500 and then sanded it back with P800 grade wet and dry, as you've seen in the other processes along the way. I did take a few minutes to sand the flaps. You can see there's some strange markings, some circles. That's some sink marks or some sort of wobbles that were in the surface of the plastic. So I sanded the area with the small sanding stick until it looked smooth. Then I've Mr. Surfaced it and sanded that back as well. And both of them had these undulations, although I don't think this wing was quite as bad. Fuselage obviously was already done, but I have now fitted the nose windows. Those just pop in from the outside, so there is a certain amount of temptation to do that after paint, but I thought it would be best to do it before. And something I've done that I'm not very happy with here is, I don't know if it's going to show on camera very well, I've glued the windows in, but you can see through the clear material that the plastic is plastic coloured there because of the ledge, which is a bit irritating. It doesn't look very good, but I've glued them in with liquid cement, so they're not going anywhere, so I'll have to live with it. My advice to you going forward would be to ensure that the ledges that the windows sit on are painted. Black would probably be best, and then glue the windows in, because that is less than ideal. But anyway, that's that. So I think the first thing to do in this video is actually, I have decided to glue these wings on, but I'm going to mask the canopy first. I'm going to fit the canopy and mask it. So in the background I have the box lid here, and all of the remaining parts for the model are in here, and they're all prepared and they're all ready to paint. So all the mould seams have been cleaned off, the part seams have been cleaned off where necessary, like on these slipper tanks for example. The seams have been cleaned away, and I've inscribed this one with an L to denote that this goes on the left hand wing. I've done the same thing on the undercarriage legs units. I'm unsure if they're exactly the same or not. They may be very slightly different to allow for dihedral, so one of them again has an L inscribed into the underneath of the mudguard, because it won't really be visible, so that I know which one's which. But other than that, all of these parts can go anywhere, and I've been through and prepped them all. Okay, so let's look at the canopies and how we're going to deal with these. So the main canopy then. So what I've done here is I have glued in one of the blister windows to the side, just one, and I'm leaving the other one out. And the reason for that is that I am going to permanently glue this canopy onto the fuselage, because to make it any model pretty much, really, to be honest, to make the transparencies look, in my opinion, look integrated, like they are a deliberate part of the finished model, they need to be fitted before the model's finished. I think any time you're painting a transparency separately and then attaching it to the model afterwards, it never really looks like it's part of the airframe to me. But the problem with doing that is the tendency that models seem to have, and this window is displaying it already, for static. I don't know if you could see the sort of dust on the inside of this window here. So yeah, small particles, dust, and actually tiny amounts of overspray from the painting process always seem to find their way inside and latch onto the transparencies, and it's something which annoys the daylights out of me. It really does. You do a beautiful job of masking and integrating a transparency, and then when you demask it, it's all fogged up from paint fumes. It's terribly irritating. So I've over the years developed strategies to try and head that off at the pass, or at least deal with it if and when it does happen, and that's why I've only fitted one of the windows. I've carried out enough test fitting to reassure myself that this one will be able to be fitted later, neatly enough to put it in later. You see it just pops in there without too much trouble. And the nose transparency I'm going to glue into position for painting with the Ammo Ultra Glue, so that can be popped off again afterwards if needs be. And the whole point of doing all of this is, let me get a micro brush out, if when I demask the canopy later that I do have any of that stray nonsense that I've mentioned that's gotten inside and is trying to ruin everything, I can get a micro brush like this and I could put it through this open window and just gently clean the inside of the transparency, and I can get at all the places I've already tested. Can pretty much get to everything from there. Likewise down here, I can get, if I need to, I can pop this nose piece off, get inside and just clean anything that's dropped onto those nose windows from the inside, and then reattach the nose and put the side window in, having done that. So that's the strategy, but the first thing I need to do is actually glue this canopy in place. Another part of my anti-fogging prep is wax. So I have here some carnauba wax. It claims to have a hint of coconut oil in it also, but the point of this being it's pure wax. It doesn't have the chemicals in it. When you give it a sniff, it doesn't smell chemically at all, and as such it doesn't tend to cause any problems with the transparencies. Some of the waxes out there that obviously are designed for vehicle refinishing and vehicle polishing have got various solvents in them which can and will actually damage the transparency rather than protecting it. So do be careful if you choose to do this to your transparencies. Just do a test on a part that you're not going to use, or a piece of the sprue or whatever. Just do a little test. So I've just got a little bit on the end of the cotton bud and I'm just working that in. And it might sound stupid, but this just makes the part a bit more slippery and it makes things a bit less inclined to stick in the first place. And it also, probably more importantly, makes the part easier to clean after the fact. So that's why I'm doing it. So flipping the cotton bud over to the clean end, I can just go back in and buff that wax back out. You can of course use a microfiber cloth or any other cloth or the end of your t-shirt if you would rather. Get this nice and buffed out. Job done. So any decent sort of wax will do. It doesn't have to be a specific. This is from Zero Paints, as you can see. It doesn't have to be something like this, just as long as you test it first and make sure it isn't going to react with your plastic parts at all. Now when it comes to fitting transparencies, I do prefer to use proper cement where possible, rather than the sort of PVA style glues. Again, mainly to try to create the appearance that the canopies are built into the airframe, because they are built in on a real aircraft. But something like this framework's all built onto the fuselage. They're not just tacked on at the end. And for me, proper liquid cement helps to attach them properly to give that impression. Now I'm finding that there's a slight gap that wants to be there, just along here. When I press down it mostly disappears, but actually this side window is causing a very minor impediment to the fit, so I'm just going to trim that slightly. And the little trimmings that come off when you do this are the kind of greeblies that seem to always want to attach themselves to the inside of the canopies. If you don't leave yourself a way in with a micro brush, you just can't get them out, and it's incredibly frustrating. Yep, that's going to do it, just a touch more. You can trim canopies any way you like. Obviously I'm using the scalpel. You could just as easily use a sanding stick if the scalpel makes you a bit too nervous. Blade is very dull, but I'm about to change it, so there we go. I think that has evened them out. There, that has pretty much dealt with that gap. I do still need to push the canopy down slightly. It does seem to, it sits in place fine. As you can see if I hold it up close, just along the back edge especially, there's a bit of a gap, and if I just push it down, it aligns itself up quite nicely. And the way to glue it's just like anything else. Get your extra thin. Be careful, obviously. Take the excess glue off on the side of the jar and just touch, and you can see where the glue goes because you can physically see it travelling with the clear plastic. There's no major risk with this kit because there's not anything just inside the canopy that's going to collect the glue and send it all up the inside of the window panes. You do need to take great care with a lot of kits of things like jets where they have a sort of a mighty instrument combing just underneath the canopy, and sometimes the glue will just track between the two and make a right mess, so do need to be careful. But in this case there's nothing like that going to happen. I'm just touching it and then spreading it along the join. There we go. Now I need to hold this in position for long enough for the glue to take so that it won't just spring back up and leave that gap. So, canopy is now dry, fixed firmly and permanently into place. There is still a very small gap along the bottom of the side window there, but we will address any gaps or issues after putting the masking on. There's nothing much wrong with that, to be fair, but let's mask it up first. So I need a fresh scalpel blade. This one is pretty much done. Revolutionary footage of scalpel blade changing ensues. Okay, this one's pretty easy because it's so old, it's quite easy to do by hand. Okay, so masking the canopy. My preferred, or the method I use the majority of the time to mask transparencies, is to use bare metal foil. This is a self-adhesive metal foil material. It's very thin, and it's quite easy to get it to conform to the majority of shapes without too much trouble. So it's very, very easy to use. Much easier actually than trying to mask with tape, Tamiya tape, because Tamiya tape or any other tape is so much thicker. As thin as it is, it's a lot thicker than this foil. It can be quite difficult to see where to cut it, where the outlines are. But the foil has this little trick up its sleeve, which I shall show you now. So you don't have to use a brand new fresh blade to do this. You do need to use a brand new fresh blade if you're using tape, and I'll probably show you that on the nose transparency there. With this you don't necessarily need a brand new blade, but you do need a blade that's not completely worn out, which is why I've changed it, because mine was. Just cut a piece off. You can measure it and fuss around, but I only really use this foil to do transparency masking, and I think this is the third sheet that I've had in the last 15 probably years or so, so it's not a major expense. Okay, plonk the piece of foil on the canopy, somewhere approximating where you want it, and initially just rub it in a little bit with a cotton bud. Tell you what, let's zoom in a little bit, shall we? That's that way. Now I'll probably work out of shot for the most part, but look how easy it is to see those frames now. That's just popped on with a cotton bud, so now I've got a cocktail stick. It's a fresh, clean cocktail stick, and it's the softwood variety, not the bamboo kind. And I'm going to use the cocktail stick to gently just burnish. Check me out using professional words. The foil right into the corners of these frame lines. When you just do it with the cocktail stick, they'll tend to be a little soft. Airfix canopy framing does tend to be slightly on the heavy side, so it is relatively easy to see. But even when the framing is really, really fine, because of the metallic nature of the sheet, it's just so easy to see the frame lines. Obviously this is playing havoc with the camera's exposure, but I hope you can get what I'm getting at there. So once that's in position, get yourself comfortable, take a deep breath, and you need to find the edge with the blade. 9 times out of 10, the blade will quite naturally follow that edge without really any issue. You do not need to press hard. I'm virtually only using the weight of the scalpel here. Which way you do it is going to depend on which way it is most easy for you to cut, and everybody has their preferences. Just double checking I'm in shot. There, I've cut all 4 lines. Tell you what, I'm going to cut this out as well, and then we'll do the big reveal. I think it's not too difficult to realise that if you do slip and send your blade off across the canopy, it's going to cause damage which will be awkward to fix. I accept that, but again, in all the time I've been using this method, I really haven't done that more than a couple of times. Be patient, take it slowly, don't press too hard, let the blade do the work, let the blade follow the raised framing, and there we go. That's those two windows done. We'll remove the excess. Just like that. And once it's cut, pick up your cocktail stick again and just gently nip back in, because when you pull off the excess it tends to just lift it very slightly. Just pop it back down again. And that's two of the many windows covered just as easily as that. And that's sealed down tight onto that transparency. There is nothing going to get under that. Even if you're a bit ham-fisted with the spraying, you should not be getting any paint under there. I know it is possible if you use Tamiya tape or similar that you will get a bit of stuff creeping under there, because they do that tape does tend to loosen its grip over time, which helps to allow paint to get under there. Get out of the way. Okay, let's do the next bit and then I'll go off camera and finish up this method. As I say, I just eyeball it, roughly cut a piece that's plenty big enough to cover the next section you want to do, and in a lot of cases it's perfectly possible to cover the entire canopy with one piece of foil and then just work your way around, removing the parts you don't want to paint. So, roughly applied. Just an initial sort of bedding down with the cotton bud, which allows us to see the frames quite happily. Cocktail stick, gently, really just snugging that foil down into these corners. And that's ready to trim. I do tend to hold the blade at a bit of an angle. It's not at 90 degrees to the part, which does, I believe, help the blade to naturally follow that corner. Bare metal foil can be a little bit awkward to get a hold of at times. I think this sheet was picked up from Hannant's, and the last time I bought any, I think the cost was around the several pounds mark for a sheet like this. But used for masking windows only, you can expect a sheet like this to last a good couple of years. So as I say, it's not really a dramatic investment. Now clearly, if you've never done this before, it might be worth practicing on something other than the kit that you're working on right now. Bit of got any spare transparencies kicking around? Have a go. There you go. Whoopsie. That's 4 windows covered. And another big advantage that the foil has over tape is in situations like here where we've got these curved quarter windows and here where we've got the blister windows, the foil is able to quite happily conform to those shapes and stay stuck. And the smaller the window gets, the harder it is for tape to remain firmly adhered whilst you're trying to cut it. You'll see if you were trying to cut one of these with Tamiya tape, you'd see the whole thing kind of moving around because the grip of the adhesive isn't strong enough to keep it in place. and it will tend to sort of lift off the curve a little bit over time. The foil will not do that. It will stay exactly where you leave it. In fact, to the point where it is, on being honest, a bit of a pain to get it back off. But yeah, huge advantage with curved pieces, with very small pieces. And as I say, you time to go to school. As I say, you're going to struggle to get paint under it. You have to be super ham-fisted to do that. So anyhow, I will do the rest of this off camera and I'll be back and on. Right, there's the canopy done, and these nose windows also. And obviously the big open window needs to be blocked off, so that's just some little pieces of tape that I've fed into the hole and sort of stuck to the inside of the canopy, and then I've just filled that out with masking fluid, just to, that fills up any tiny gaps, but it also sort of holds it all together and holds it in. And underneath I've done some tape discs for some of these cameras. They're just done with the punch and die set. They're not the cleanest cut. It's not the cleanest cut, my die set anymore. Not sure why, but they'll do. These will be done with foil in the same way as all these others have been. But I just thought I'd quickly show you the use of tape, because if you don't fancy cutting against your canopy, and I would perfectly understand if you didn't, you can do it with strips of tape. So I'll use the other canopy that isn't going to be used in the model just to show. I'll just take these distracting doodads off to show how you can do it with strips of tape. And as I said before, you do need a very fresh or a very good knife blade for this. If you try and use one that's dull, it won't really, well, it'll make a mess of it, honestly. So, strip of tape, which is now out of sight because I've just zoomed the camera. Oh well. I use the steel rule, and I'm going to cut a strip off the edge of this tape that's roughly about 1 millimetre wide, I guess. I'm not measuring it, just doing it by eye, but I would imagine it comes out at about 1 millimetre. And there it is. Then you can line this up on let me get under the camera because I've zoomed it, it's too far away. You can line this up adjacent to your canopy frames. Get it in position. And try to use a strip to do, you know, a few windows like I'm doing here. Just encourage it into position. There we go. And just push that down with a finger or whatever. And then you come in with your knife blade that is sharp. And as we were before, locate the edge of the strip where it needs to finish. And don't cut, just push down. You will feel, and sometimes hear, a really quite satisfying kind of click as it goes through. And you shouldn't, all things being equal, you shouldn't really damage the canopy in any way doing this. And obviously that's why it really ideally needs to be a fresh blade. I just picked that whole thing up because it wasn't cut well enough. That's fine, I can just pop it back into position and repeat the cut. There we go, like so. Now once you've got one strip down, you're just going to come back in with your piece of tape and lay it down in a different direction. Again, just line it up with the edge of the frames. Like so, and literally just work your way around each panel, lining up the tape with the edges of the frames, trimming them where they meet the next frame. As I say, with this sort of pressing motion rather than trying to cut. If you try to cut, it will just drag the tape straight off the canopy. And when you get so that you have a panel outlined, which this basically is now, what you need is, again, from your strip of tape that's taped down to your cutting mat, you can cut slightly larger, slightly wider strips, and then separate those strips into segments, little squares, like so. And it essentially fill your open space with these little pieces of tape that have been cut out. Do have to be very thorough and make sure that you do not have any tiny little areas that aren't quite covered, and then you should end up with something that looks something like this, and that's one window mast. Now, to me personally, I find this method much more fiddly and time consuming, to be honest, but there's very little risk of damaging your plastic part by using your knife to trim. It is also true, of course, that you can use Tamiya tape in the same way that I demonstrated the foil earlier. You can place a piece over a window, and I would generally tend to line at least one edge up with a frame if I can when I do this. I don't really do it like this anymore ever, to be honest, so I find bare metal foil a lot easier. And you see, I've just used the back side of my fine pointed tweezer to burnish that tape into the edges of the framework, and just as with the foil, you must work your way around with the knife. It is much more difficult to judge where the framework actually sits with this, because you really can't see it quite as well as you can with the foil, and you do have to cut quite a lot more firmly because tape has more substance to it. It's harder to cut. There we go. So that's two more ways that you can use for masking these. I use all three of these methods at varying times, but it is rare, honestly, that they cut out in situ like that with the tape anymore on canopies, because, as I say, to me the bare metal foil is just considerably easier. As a final touch, you can, if you wish, as a belts and braces kind of approach, get some masking fluid, whatever type you happen to have in, and just carefully pop that on top of all your little pieces of tape, and then that will guard against a couple of things. It will guard against any of those tiny gaps that I just mentioned that might be there that you can't see, and there we go, like so. it will guard against the tiny pieces of tape being easily sort of knocked ajar with handling, or even knocked off completely, that you may or may not notice until it's much too late. And covering the whole thing with the masking fluid will neatly prevent that from being an option. So there we have all of the methods of masking covered. Now, with all of those windows finally masked, and I've got the other one stuck to a spatula here ready to go as well, it's time to do that final assembly. And I've already fitted the left hand wing, and I'm now going to go through what I've done by showing you the right hand wing. So I masked out the inside part covering the exhaust because it's just a bit easier to get at when it's not fitted. It's perfectly possible through here, but just a touch easier. And I've just stuck a piece of foam in that radiator inlet area. I've already, as you know, painted all the internal areas and the sort of leading edges of this, so it doesn't need to be perfect. It just needs to stop stuff going in there and getting on the radiators. So first things first, we'll mask this inside area up. This is really just to cover up the exhaust, which is probably a touch less fiddly to mask this whole area than it is to try and mask the exhaust alone, which is obviously why we did it in the first place. And again, the whole thing's going to be the same colour as what's already painted here, so ultimate peak accuracy isn't necessarily really required in terms of making sure that all of this blue is completely covered. Okay, that's all done there then, quick and easy. I've got a piece of foam. This is just ordinary packaging foam. Most of mine has come out of various Edward photo etched and brass insets actually over the years. I've just kept quite a lot of it, but you can get this out of all kinds of things. It's also useful for doing paint effects, sponge chippings and things like that. Just cut out a piece which is big enough to go into the orifice which requires masking, and then I find this really quite satisfying, but just use tweezers or a suitable implement of your choice. Just introduce the material into the place that needs to be masked, like so. This little bit of excess on the end here needs to go because that's going to get in the way of the wing joint, so I'll just get rid of it with the scalpel like so. So that is masked up to the same standard as this one. Now, slight departure on the gluing front. I'm going to use standard Tamiya. I believe this is the standard Tamiya cement. It's poison. This is much thicker, gloopier than normal, than sort of extra thin and the like, but it stays open in terms of being useful as glue for a lot longer, so it can be really handy for gluing larger parts together. And what I'm going to do is apply some of that onto the top and bottom of each of these spars. Consistency is similar to that of sort of Revel contactor. Now pop your spars in your holes carefully and just wiggle that on through all the way in, and that will just mean that the spars are glued to the internal surface of the wing, which will just make everything a bit sturdier. And then to back that up, come back to the extra thin and pop that along the joint as usual. Go. Make sure before everything's completely dry, give it a good old eyeball and make sure it's straight or straight enough for you. There's not a massive amount you can do about it if it's not because of the spars, but that doesn't look too bad to me. Good enough. And obviously that needs to set up and get dry before we address the joint in whichever way we choose. Masking the undercarriage bays is often a bit of a chore. In this case though, Airfix were kind enough to supply a moulded spare undercarriage door complete with slots which clear the spigots that the doors fit to, so we can just pop those on and they kind of lightly press into place, so they don't need to be glued in any way. They'll sit there. They might blow off under airbrushing if you use a lot of pressure, but they're fairly nice. They'll just sit there. So that's those done, and they have moulded the word mask onto each one to avoid any possible confusion. And lastly, the tower planes. It is still optional at this point whether or not you want to fit these, because they do fit beautifully. Now, looking at the version that I am doing, this one, the American one, there isn't any real reason to keep the tower planes off at this point. Honestly, that masking isn't terrifically difficult, so I am going to fit the tower planes. If you plan on doing this version, and especially if you plan on masking that rather than using the decal, you may benefit slightly from leaving the tower planes off, but even then it's not really a big issue. So I am going to fit them, and with these I am simply going to put them into position as I have done several times dry fitting before. And then just put some extra thin around the join area, like so. Again, once you've got the glue on, do a bit of eyeballing and make sure that the tail planes are square to the rest of the model and to the fin. Mine are not quite, so I'm just going to tweak them slightly, and they should just sort of smoothly move because the glue is not completely set yet. Will do nicely. And now this needs to sit to one side just long enough for these various glues to set up a little bit, and then we can look at the joints and decide whether or not any sort of filling is going to be required. And finally we'll mask the other side of the nacelles and the wingtip lights. Gap filling then. There's not really much in the way of gaps here at all. The fit on this thing is very, very nice, but we do have some very, very slight gaps here, the edge of the radiator shroud, and just a touch there and little bits along the bottom. It really isn't anything terrible, and I did say I was going to show the canopy as well, didn't I? So first off, these gaps on the edge of the radiator shrouds I could fill with Mr. Surfacer, but it would take a while to dry. and then it would probably need sanding as well. So what I'd like to do, what I like to use instead is this stuff. This is Vallejo. As you can see, I've had it a minute. Plastic putty. It's white and it's very water based, and all you need to do, it's got this lovely fine applicator nozzle on it. Get that where your gap is and pretend you're using some silicone in your bathroom. Just force some of that into the gap. And take a cocktail, it's not a cocktail stick, a cotton bud, dampen it and wipe it across the surface to instantly remove all of the excess and leave a finished product. That is as much as needs doing to that join. I'll repeat it on this side. That's taken out a bit more than I wanted it to, so I'm just going to pop a bit more in. I find if you don't moisten the cotton bud, it doesn't really wipe it off well enough or smoothly enough, and if you do moisten it, it can be a bit too effective. There you go, that's that one done as well. And the rest of the wing joint, and I'm not going to do a thing with the tail planes, they're just absolutely perfect. I'm going to use Mr. Surfacer, and that is going to induce a drying time and some further rectification, but I'm going to do it anyway. So, Mr. Surfacer 500, this stuff is almost irreplaceable in the toolbox, honestly, and has been used a fair bit throughout this build. Any old skanky paintbrush is fine. Get some gloop and muddle it up on the lid here, and I'm just going to paint it into the affected areas. It's not going to fully fill anything, but what it will do is bridge across the sort of visual gap. It's very, very small, it's insignificant, it's not really worth worrying about. And if you tried to fill a defect like this properly, I say properly, using filler and sanding, honestly you would cause more damage than you would mitigate. So it's, you know, same on the top. Just get it to go into that join where there is one. Don't be shy and don't worry about making a mess. I use that sort of spinning motion with the paintbrush because it helps the surface to actually go into the join rather than just sitting on the top next to it. And that's that. I'm going to do the same thing around the base of this canopy. As I said, there were some very, very slight issues still. So again, I'm just going to paint Mr. Surfacer. And we don't need to worry about it because we've got masking on there now. That's why I did it. That's why I didn't do it before. And it's funny because the canopy join can look really good right up until you put some paint on it. Because of the sort of visual trickery of having a clear part and the non-clear parts, you sometimes can't really tell if the join's all that good until you put some paint on. So it's not a bad idea to do this as a matter of course. There we go. And fine sort of gaps and the kind of stuff that just looks a little bit ugly but isn't really an issue. The surfacer will just fill that up, no bother. Pop a bit more on there. Okay, that's that done. Well, you join me the next day. I left the Mr. Surfacer overnight. It's best to leave it a good while Overnight is good if you put a reasonable amount on, which I did in this wing root, ended up with a reasonable amount, and indeed around this sort of windscreen area. So it's best to leave it overnight really. It's a solvent thing, so it needs time to evaporate properly. And now I'm going to remove it, and it's exactly the same process as with the Vallejo, except instead of using water or spit, I'm going to use Mr. Colour Thinner. You'll just have to trust me that this bottle has Mr. Colour Thinner in it. Sniff test. Yeah, smell-o-vision isn't with us yet, but it is Mr. Colour Thinner. You can use IPA to do this as well, isopropyl alcohol as opposed to beer, and it will do it. It just takes a little bit longer, and in some circumstances that's actually an advantage because it'll take a bit less away. As you can see, it fairly quickly softens that paint, and you're basically just wiping off the excess, much as you did with the Vallejo. The difference being in with Mr. Surfacer and the thinners is that you can put it into a much smaller defect in it and expect it to stay there, whereas the Vallejo will tend to want to wipe out on you if it's a really tiny gap. I'm hoping I was under the camera all this time. I am. Okay, there we go. And that has just mitigated that little gap. There probably is a slight difference on the real thing because the wing does go right through the entire fuselage, but then again it was probably fabricked and doped over. I don't know, I've not looked that closely at a real Mosquito with a view to discerning that detail, so either way, a big gap isn't prototypical and we don't want it. There you go, finished. Excuse me again. No more gaps, so when you paint the thing there may still be some unevenness there, but there won't be sort of the big, very obvious dark gap, so it disguises it and saves messing about with actual filling and actual sanding. So the same goes for the canopy. I've looked at it now that I looked at it while I was painting it on, and I've looked at it again now that it's dry, and I'm happy that whatever faults are there will be able to be resolved with this little bit of surfacer. And I'm doing exactly the same thing. I'm not worried about the masking. The thinners isn't going to go under it because it's bare metal foil, and there's not that much on the cotton bud anyway. I'm just wiping away the excess, and it just leaves a little bit sat in that joint area like so. Now at the front you can see that it looks a bit sharp, and it doesn't really look like simply, and I'm talking specifically this area here, it doesn't look exactly like the Mr. Surfacer, and just wiping off is actually going to completely get rid of that. So I've got a little piece of my 800 here, got some water on it, and I'm just going to use the folded edge so it'll sand right on its edge like so. And again, I'm not worried about the transparencies. The bare metal foil will protect the transparency from this sanding as long as you only use fine sanding media and as long as you are gentle. And I'm just going to tickle it. So I've put a curve into it with my thumb, which makes it sort of stay rigid, if you like, when you're trying to sand with it. And this is just going to take those little sharp edges away. Doesn't take much. That does look better. And then I'll finish off in exactly the same way with the Mr. Colour Thinner on the cotton bud. Just pop a bit on there. It's not soaking wet. Just, you can sand it all off with the sandpaper if you prefer. This is just quicker. Yeah, I think you get the idea. I'll just finish this off and I'll be back in a moment. Alright, with all that done, the last little bit I want to show you is just these nav lights. I haven't bothered colouring them in or anything else like that. I'm just going to leave them clear. I'm not sure exactly whether they should be coloured or not, but clear is fine for now. But they do need masking. And my favourite way of masking things like this, because they can be a real pain because they're so small, is I'll just get a piece of tape like this, and I've just eyeballed the angle and cut it with scissors so that it fits. It doesn't have to be exact, to be fair. Just pop it on like that and flip them over and put another piece on the bottom. Again, I've just cut the angle with scissors, line it up, put it on, and the two pieces of tape will naturally stick together at the edges, and then I just use my tweezers to pinch it together tightly around the light, like so. And finally, with the scissors, I just trim it down, because when it's big like that, sticking out a lot, it has a tendency to catch everything when you're moving the model around, and you can pull it off. Okay, and there it is, all masked up. Everything. Quite a lot of windows for such a non-windowy subject. Obviously, pre-cut mask sets are an option. I don't mind using them at all. They greatly increase speed of masking in almost all cases. The main ones that I've used up to now have been Edward, and they are good, they're good quality. But I do tend to find that they never really exactly fit a lot of the time, so I end up trimming them a bit, which sort of cuts into that time saving, and I personally think they're quite expensive for what they are. But anyway, this is how you can do it if you don't want to use a mask set, but they are undoubtedly quite a bit quicker if you do want to use them. So the last thing that needs to be done before actually getting on with putting colour on this thing is that the canopy framing areas need to be undercoated, because we need the internal colour on first, so that when the model is viewed, the sort of insides of the canopy are the right colour, if you like. So I'm going back to my internal mix, which it says C364 on the jar. It's actually, as you already know, pretty much, let's say, a 50-50 mix of XF71 Cockpit Green IJN and XF21 Sky, and there's usually a dash of white in there, but this has been constantly topped up and mixed and added to. This is my colour that I've ended up with. So I'm going to pop some of that in the airbrush and just overcoat the areas, all of these transparencies, and actually the wingtips as well, and also in the tail wheel bait where I've now added the tail planes. I'm just going to paint those green. There we are, that's all of the little bits painted green, and you might think we're finished there, but we're not. And the reason for that is transparency, honestly. So these parts, I've painted them green, and I'm quite sure that they appear to be green, like the wingtips. You can't really see where the transparent stops and the solid plastic starts. I mean, you see the join, but the colour looks the same. The problem is, and I can't really demonstrate because I don't have a suitable light source to put underneath the model, but if you hold the model up to the light, try it on your own if you're building along, paint the thing green and then hold it up to the light, you can still quite clearly see through these parts. And what happens is you can paint the rest of it, and it's particularly prevalent if you paint your clear parts off the model. When you actually finally put them on, you'll note that the colours don't appear as opaque, and they still appear to be a bit transparent, and in fact look different to the rest of the model. And that is because of the ability of the light to still shine through this paint layer. So to mitigate this, we paint them black. So I've put the green in, so anything that you can see through the transparencies will now appear green, and then I'll paint over it with black. I put the black straight into the airbrush, which is why it looks a bit grey. I haven't cleaned it out between colours. It really doesn't matter. It will get blacker as I go. And there we have it. The little mosquito is now ready to be coloured in. You can use any black you like for this. I've used a Tamiya LP5 because it's nice and smooth. And now with that little, it's this shiny because it's thinned down quite heavily. But you can quite clearly see how that windscreen and canopy are nicely blended into the surface of the model now, and don't appear separate. I can't prove that the wingtips are no longer see-through. As I say, I don't have a suitable light source, but if you hold the model up to the window now, there is still a slight see-through effect, but it's minimised by this black layer, and of course by the time that the blue is put over the top, it's gone, and these parts will appear exactly the same as the rest of the airframe, which is what you want. So there it is, ready to go. In the next instalment, we'll tick off any little sort of final things that need to be done, get it cleaned up and start getting it coloured in. Thank you very much everyone for watching. Thank you for your support. Thanks for building along, those of you that are. There are quite a few of you. I hope your models are going well, and please feel free to send me any updates that you wish to. So I'll look forward to seeing you next time, and with all of that said, it only remains for me to say, look after yourselves, look after each other, and Genesis out.